About what are you curious? I confess to being more curious about things that are in the future, things that haven't happened yet. What would happen if we did this? That's where my curiosity goes. But I learned to be curious about things that are around me right now from my son Elliot. When he was little, I would walk him to and from school most days. It was only about a mile, but with him it could take a very long time. He was what you would call a lollygagger. I would be busy in my head thinking about my future thoughts, and he would stop me and say, "Mama, look at this bug." And then he would squat down on the ground in a way that my knees could only envy, and he would point out the smallest little bug and watch it as it journeyed across a leaf. Or he'd call out, "Mama, look, an owl." And sure enough, hidden in the leaves of a maple tree would be an owl watching us as we walked by. I learned to schedule in more times for our walks, at least some mornings each week, so that he had the time to see whatever he needed to see, and I didn't feel a need to rush him on my way to the next thing. I'm grateful for his little voice calling out, "Mama, look," on our walks to school, reminding me to be present to the beauty that's around me, reminding me to be aware. I think about him now each day as I walk to and from Calvary. I try to have eyes to see and time to notice the designs on the Victorian houses, the typeface on a fire station, the people I pass on the street. Fun fact, I've discovered that you really freak people out in San Francisco when you say hello to them on the street. Who knew? What do you observe as you go about your days? How willing are you to be sidetracked when something unexpected occurs? Moses got sidetracked. Now, Moses is often known for looking like Charlton Heston and being a hero, but in the text we heard today, he hasn't gotten to be that Moses quite yet. Moses was raised in Pharaoh's house after Pharaoh's daughter had pulled him out of the river. He was a Hebrew baby whose mother had entrusted him to God's care because Pharaoh was murdering all the Hebrew babies. So Moses grows up in a life of privilege. But then he murdered an Egyptian who was bothering a Hebrew slave, and he had to flee the palace and the life he'd known. Our story picks up not long after he has been taken in by a man named Jethro and has been married to one of Jethro's daughters. He's gone from living in the palace to tending flocks on the hillside, and the text tells us he is beyond the wilderness. He is 40 miles from the end of nowhere. And he sees a bush, and it's burning, but it's not burning up. And he thinks, I wonder what's going on. And God speaks to him in that moment from the burning bush. This is what I noticed about a story that's pretty familiar to me. It says that God spoke to Moses when the Lord saw that Moses turned aside to see. What if Moses hadn't turned aside to see? What if Moses hadn't been curious? What if Moses had thought, great, a bush is on fire, I better hike this other trail and stay away from it? Would God have spoken to him then? The text makes it sound as if Moses became God's conversation partner because of his curiosity. When the Lord saw that he had turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush and said, "Moses, Moses." Moses answered, "Here I am." Moses had his first opportunity to engage when he stopped and turned aside to see what was going on, but the second opportunity was when he heard a voice calling his name. He could quickly have decided that it was just the heat or that he'd heard something funny in the wind. He could have just kept on walking. He could have decided that if God were in fact to speak to him, then God certainly would have picked a more majestic and a tall tree, a better location. He would have decided that God couldn't possibly have been speaking to him from a lowly piece of shrubbery out in the middle of nowhere. He could have kept on working. Moses had grown up in Pharaoh's court where if gods were present, it was in the midst of decorations of gold with great fanfare and in the midst of a royal court. But out beyond the wilderness, with his flocks and a bunch of scrub brush, Moses hears his name and answers, "Here I am." This is the Moses I admire, not the big hero leading the people, but the shepherd out beyond the wilderness with his flocks, with his curiosity to engage the divine conversation. I admire Moses who can recognize his name when it is being called from the middle of a shrub that's on fire. And I'm aware that too often I get distracted by all the other things I have to do, and I speed through one thing and then to the next as if I don't have time to stop and look. How many times have I walked past a bush that's on fire? This text reminds us to be present in the moment, so that when we hear our name being called in unlikely places, we can find the time to stop and say, "Here I am." Some of you are better than I am at that, no doubt, but I hope we'll all pause this week when we're about our ordinary tasks of tending our father-in-law's flocks on a hillside and just be curious about what is going on around us. I hope we will trust that God may choose to be present with us in places we would not expect to find her. Moses becomes God's conversation partner because he was willing to take the time and willing to be curious and willing to trust that God might show up. The story we heard this morning from Matthew's gospel does not give us Peter's first encounter with the divine. He had fared much better in that story than he does today. This story marks the beginning of the end, or the end of Jesus' earthly ministry at least. The text tells us, "From that time on," and it marks the point in Matthew's gospel where Jesus turns his eye toward Jerusalem, preparing for a path that lay ahead. And Jesus begins preparing his disciples for what was to come, and Peter did not like what he heard. God forbid, that's the worst idea I've ever heard. Hand yourself over to the authorities to be tortured and crucified? We're not going to let that happen, Jesus. Even though I know the ending to the story, and even though I know that Jesus had it all under control, I understand why Peter said what he said. Because we don't want the ones we love to suffer, and we don't want the ones we love to die. And so Jesus' answer to Peter sounds harsh in our ears. "Get behind me, Satan." Well, all right then, you go ahead and suffer. You just don't have to call me Satan. I kid, that's not really what Peter says. When Peter and Jesus were talking, Satan was not a personal name of one person who wore red and was wearing horns. The Satan means the tempter or the adversary. And perhaps the reason that Jesus responds so seriously to Peter's comments is I wonder if maybe Jesus was having the same thoughts himself. Perhaps Peter's comments were real temptations for Jesus. Get behind me, tempter. It's easy not to be tempted by things you don't want anyway. If someone tried to tempt me with all the mustard in the world and a trip to a war zone and a bag of sour candy, I would not be tempted in the least. It would be easy to let those temptations pass me by. But life and health and not being tortured, that would be tempting, wouldn't it? Jesus won't be tempted. Get behind me, tempter, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things. And I think that's our problem. We set our mind on human things. Remember Moses on the mountain? I invite you to remember Moses as you try to figure out the difference between keeping your mind on human things or divine things. Because I don't think Jesus is saying heaven is a divine thing and the grocery store is just a human thing. I think Jesus is saying that if you try to make sense of God with only human understanding, then God's not going to make sense. It didn't make sense for a bush to be burning and not to be consumed. It didn't make sense for God to speak to someone out beyond the wilderness while he was tending flocks, someone who had no power, who was a fugitive. It didn't make sense, for that matter, for Jesus to suffer and be tortured and die on a cross. And that's how God works, in divine ways, not according to ways that make sense to us. So I think setting our mind on divine things is akin to having curiosity, to trusting that there is more to the story than we can imagine, and to stop trying to limit what God can do. Jesus goes on to tell his disciples all sorts of things that if we were to define them by human things, they would leave us scratching our heads. If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will find it. For what will it profit if they gain the whole world to forfeit their life? Maybe we need to approach these words like Moses did the bush, deciding to turn our heads and ponder something that doesn't make sense. Returning to the Moses story for a minute, Moses showed his curiosity and his willingness to see things in another perspective, and then God shared things with him that Moses could not ever have imagined for himself. God informs Moses that he will lead God's people. Moses, the fugitive murderer, sheep tender from beyond the wilderness, is going to go to Pharaoh and speak for God. Moses has a couple questions. First, why would Pharaoh listen to me? Second, why would the Israelites listen to me? And they're good questions Moses asks, because one could see how Pharaoh wouldn't be so interested in hearing from the turncoat, the one raised in his palace, only to abandon the family business. I can see why the Israelites wouldn't want to hear from him either. They don't know him. Why would they listen to him when they know their other leaders, when they trust their other leaders? But God answers Moses' questions, sort of. To the first question, who am I to go to Pharaoh? God says, well, Moses, not everything's about you, but I will be with you when you go before him. That's a kind of rough translation of the Hebrew. To the second question about who sends Moses to the Israelites, the answer is, I am who I am. Another way to translate that is, I will be who I will be. Perhaps a reminder from God that the divine cannot be contained in human ways or understandings. Moses could set his mind on human things if he wanted to, but it wouldn't solve his dilemma. It wouldn't make his job as spokesman for God any easier. It might, in fact, just get in his way. So Moses instead sets his mind on divine things and determines that God must have a plan and that his part in all of it was to trust and accept and just see what happened. Once Peter heard his rebuke from Jesus, "Get behind me, Satan," Peter had some choices too. He could have quit and left the band, and that would likely have crossed my mind if Jesus had called me Satan. But there's no indication that Peter leaves. Perhaps he's easily or quickly able to take Jesus' rebuke to heart and realizes that leaving in his embarrassment would set his mind on human things. Peter reminds us it can be divine work to hear critique, to admit we're wrong, to change our behavior. I listened to an interesting TED Talk this week by Catherine Schultz titled "On Being Wrong." She asked the audience, how does it feel to be wrong? And people answered, it's shameful or dreadful, it's bad, it's embarrassing. And she observed they'd answered a different question, which was, how does it feel to realize that you're wrong? She observed that we're wrong all the time, but we're rarely aware of our wrongness. We very rarely consider we could be wrong in the present moment. We look back at our lives and we can see the mistakes we've made. We can easily see the errors of other people. But it's a particular human condition, and it has me wondering just what I am wrong about right now. If we set ourselves on divine things, is it any easier to consider that we might not have all the right answers? The disciples and Peter hear Jesus' instructions about cross-bearing, about life losing, about the inbreaking of the kingdom of God. And they may not have gotten it exactly in that moment, but they continued on with Jesus toward Jerusalem. And as they journeyed with him through Holy Week, as they encountered the risen Lord, it seemed they continued to think back on what he said. They continued to turn aside, to consider something that did not make sense in human terms. The disciples go on to become servant leaders. Many of them found their lives by losing their identities as fishermen, by becoming disciples and evangelists. Many of them realized that all they had to give in return for the gift of their life was their life, to offer it up to God as a living sacrifice, and to trust that God's plan was better when defined in divine things rather than by human things. So this week I invite us to spend some time with this text from Matthew's Gospel and to take time to be curious about strange instructions that don't make sense, that don't fall easy on our ears. I pray that, like Moses, our curiosity will lead us into a conversation with God and will allow us to hear our name when God calls it from an unexpected place. I pray that that will then send us into God's service, trusting that I will be who I will be is the one leading us into the future. Amen.